Hello and welcome to the BYU Library Family History webinar. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Olivia Tuller and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on February 9th with Catherine Grant. She will be giving a presentation entitled Best Practices for Entering Information in Family Search Family Tree, Part 2, Specific Guidance. If you would like to access the previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be giving a presentation on moving beyond birth, marriage, and death records. Before we begin, here's a little bit about James. James has over 40 years experience in genealogical research and is an avid blogger of Genealogy Star blog. He has served as a family history volunteer for 18 years and has presented at expos and conferences around the US, Canada, and Europe. He is a member of the board of directors of the Family History Guide Association and is currently serving at the BYU Family History Library. James is a professional photographer and has 7 children, 34 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. And if James is ready, we can turn the time over to him.
Okay. Glad to be here. Welcome to another webinar from the Brigham Young University Family History Library. We are looking today about moving beyond birth, marriage, and death records. And we'll get right into it. Specific records about birth, marriages, and deaths are usually the first and sometimes the only records that some people look for. Now, it's obvious that that would be helpful to know when a person was born and when a person died, and even more helpful to know when they got married. But this basically is not the sole research effort and the sole research goal of genealogy. What we need to understand is that there are other aspects to the program. And I'm going to discuss today a little bit about the limitations of the birth, marriage, and death records, and some of the places we can move beyond, how we move beyond those, and become a little more accurate and sure about the way that we're doing our genealogical research. So it's interesting because with the advent of the online family trees, like Family Search and Ancestry and MyHeritage and Find My Past and all the others, they seem like when you look at the sources that are attached, and we're grateful that people attach sources, and it's very important to attach all of these sources, including all these birth, marriage, and death sources. But it's also interesting to note, like in this example here, that in the case that there are now 45 sources attached to this person, and it turns out that every one of them is a birth, marriage, or death record. So there are no records here that go beyond records that are generated from this, what we would call vital records, or records that deal with birth, marriage, and death. And so this is probably one of the best indications. So with those 45 sources, you would begin to think that you have really focused in on this person, and that a lot of work had been done, and there probably wasn't much more to be done because, boy, there are 45 sources here, man. That's a lot of research. Well, that may be the case, but that is not by any means the what you might call end product, or what we need to have and what we need to know about this individual. And one thing I can say about this, having this number of birth, marriage, and death records, is that despite the fact that there are all these records, it's very, very likely that, number one, all those records do not pertain to this person or this family, and that all these records, in fact, do not belong to this person at all, and that they've got the wrong one. So the only thing we could do to make sure that we have the right person is to move beyond this one category of records that we have available historically. What happens here is that, for example, I mentioned just a second ago that it could be the wrong person. And my own personal experience in the last few weeks has been that I have gotten into that situation in my own efforts. In other words, I matched a person whose parents were the names correct. The children's names seemed to match. The husband was there, and all the birth records and everything were available. And I added them all in, only to find out when I finally got beyond these records that I had basically chosen the wrong person. That there was another person who was so closely attached to that person that it was the wrong person. And then it turned out that I had it mixed in two different people as I looked at the records, and they were all consistent. And it seemed like they all had the same records. So that was one difficulty that happened. And I'll come back to that kind of issue a little bit as we go along here. So the main one, I'm assume, and this is just from my own personal observation, that the reason we stop with birth, marriage, and death records is due to the standard forms of entry forms for Western European countries and their former colonies. So when we get this form on our screen, it says name. It says something about the sex of the person, the deceased, whether deceased or living, and you have birth, you have death. And if you scroll down a little bit further, there's another entry for marriage. And that's it. This form, for the most part, asks for those three pieces of information and nothing else. And if you realize that there's more information that's necessary, it then becomes difficult to add in that additional information. But you find out that as time has gone on, there's going to be more and more efforts to add additional options of putting in various types of information. And to be fair, Family Search, where this particular form came from, has already begun that process of adding additional fields, if you call them that, or places to enter additional types of information. And so that kind of progress as they're going along may aid us in moving away from simply filling out the form and thinking, well, that's all they really want, is that what they've asked for? And the answer to that, of course, is it's valuable, but it's not the end. So this from a historical standpoint, relying on birth, marriage, and death records gives only a very small view of the past and leads to errors and duplicates. It's probably one of the most common reasons why there are duplicate records, because a Tom Smith born or a Thomas Smith born in England in a certain parish on a certain date, and getting married on a certain date and dying on a certain date, you would think that those would be unique, except basically we don't always find all three records. We find just one of those three records, like a marriage record. And so we estimate a birth record. We see about a birth record. And then we know the person didn't live past 110 years, so we estimate a death record. And so all of that kind of accumulates in the family trees, so that the next person along goes back and they don't know if this is the same person or not. So they create a new person and there's another duplicate in the record. So that's how that looks. But it's like looking through a keyhole. You get a very, very limited view of what is on the other side. And you really can't tell what the person was all about. And there's only a limited way of discerning if this person is the same as or different from someone who lives in the same area at the same time. So here's the ultimate example, and I alluded to this just a moment ago, and that is that when I got through this process of looking at the two individuals, they had the same names. They had very, very similar birth dates. They had wives who had the same names. They had children who matched in having the same names. And what it turned out is that these two men, born in the same year, at the same place, with the same wives, and they lived next door to each other. So all the records were showing exactly the same information, almost exactly the same information about these two men who married wives, who had the same name and who married wives with the same names, and then named their kids all the same. Well, it was not unusual that people would name their children all the same because given names in England, and this happened in England, were tremendously limited. There's a lot of Georges and Williams and Roberts and a few James and a few things like that. Those names are tremendously, John, are tremendously popular and used very frequently, even today. They will show up on any top 10 list of male names. Even though some other names become very, very popular, these old names just seem to be there always. And second, the current form and availability of specific birth merit doesn't send our view back very far. These records just have not been generated far enough in the past to be completely useful. And as a result of that, we have people who come in and look for the records for an extended period of time and focus on a marriage record or focus on a birth record or focus on a death record. And they think that they're compelled by some rule of genealogy that every blank space be filled with something. And so these kinds of things really are one of the things that generate the changes that go on in a family, like the family search website with the family tree, or create confusion down through family lines, because time is spent looking for specific records when those specific records may or may not exist. So let's look at some of the kinds of records and how these records, the normal types of records that you would look at for birth, marriages, and deaths, and see what we need to know about these records. For example, Catholic Church records infrequently contain birth or death dates. So they only record dates for baptisms and burials and marriages. And there are a couple of others, confirmations, there's dispensation records, there's other kinds of records, Catholic Church records out there. But the ones that are generally available today online and are used most frequently are those parish registers, diocese registers that reflect only, do not usually have birth records and do not usually have death dates at all. So what do they have? They generally have a christening date. And so if you go to any of those, you'll find christenings. But here, for example, is an actual date. The Church of England parishes did not generally record BMD records or information before 1538. That was when King Henry VIII broke from the Catholic Church and established the Church of England, and ordered the parish priests to begin recording information about their christenings and their burials and their marriages. So they were basically ordered to do that. Compliance with that did not take place for many years, until Queen Victoria came along and said, if you don't record those informations, we're going to take some drastic action, like cut off your head or whatever. So there were some very compelling reasons to do it from there on. But this is a reality in any group of records, that at some point in time, there was a place in time where the record began to be recorded, and that records before that time simply do not exist. And so we need to look in a good source, and here what we can do is look in the Family Search Research Wiki for information about where and when any particular type of record began to be recorded. The advantage of this giant resource of over 100,000 articles gives us specific information about record types. And if you were looking at this English church records page from the research wiki on familysearch.org, you would see this is a history of the parish registers in England, and it goes on to explain about although a nationwide order was given in 1538 that each parish keep a register, many parishes did not start until beginning in 1598, and copied until they were copied, and later until they were ordered to do so. And so this is the kind of, once you understand that how these records evolved and how they became available, and even though you can click very rapidly today and get into those records and start extracting information, or even find them through record hints or whatever, is that you are you're limited in what you think, because you think, well, there's always going to be birth records. Well, they're not, and there never were in England. There was never, until civil registration began in 1837, there were no birth records for consistently for any place in England. And so putting in a birth date in an English record that dates before 1837, you can probably assume it's inaccurate or was made up or estimated, because they probably do not have a specific record showing a birth date. Now, there are some exceptions. Whenever you have a general rule like this, you find that there were people whose birth date was recorded if they were famous, rich, or whatever. And then there were people who, just for whatever reason, we happened to have a record that recorded their birth date. But this was not generally available throughout the population. So even though, and by the way, reminding you, the Church of England records, like Catholic records, only contain baptism, marriage, and burial information. They do not contain birth and death information. Okay, now take death, for example. It was obvious that if somebody died, they probably got buried after a very short period of time. The answer to that is what happens if they died at sea and they never found the body, or for whatever other reason, they wandered off into the wilderness and never found a body. And we never know the death date. So death dates are not something that's like absolutely going to always be available. There's just not that's just not the way the world works. And birth records are only mandated at the time, like I mentioned, when the governments became involved, and they wanted to know specifically how old people were. Why did they want to know how old people were? For statistical reason, but when you get right down to it, they wanted to know when the men were old enough to get in the army and be drafted. So that was one of the major incentives for creating a mandatory way of recording birth records. And if you really want to know where the origin of the civil registration came from Napoleon when he established the Napoleonic era and the empire in Europe, which was very short-lived. But one of the byproducts of Napoleon was that they wanted all the birth records so they could get people into the armies, and that just persisted afterwards and is now pretty well uniform throughout the Western European and derivative worlds, the former colonies of the Western Europeans, where they have civil registration records, and now has been initiated in many, many countries around the world, except for the United States. We do not have a centralized, mandated civil registration system in the United States. Neither do we have national ID cards. So those are things that are very, very common in the rest of the world and not common here in the United States. So here's another very important fact. Church christening records, the baptism records, those dates do not correspond with birth dates directly. There's an assumption, and it happens many, many times in online family trees, where you will see someone has a christening date and they have the same date for a baptism date. Well, if the christening date is actually from a record and it says they were christened on that date, then that date is probably accurate. the birth date that is there, it is absolutely not accurate, because it would be very, very rare if you went through the list of sources, or any sources, if there were any sources for that person, to find that there was an actual birth date. And assuming that they're christened on their birth is not even a valid assumption. First of all, there were very few women who had just given birth who would leap out of bed with their brand new born baby, run down to the priest, pay the fee, and have the baby baptized. That isn't the way it worked. And there was usually a time period, 8 to 10 days or more, between the birth and the baptism. In addition to that, a person may not have been baptized at all. The people may be too poor, they couldn't pay the fee that was required by the church. So they just never got their children baptized. And then, for some event occurred, for instance, in one of my lines, where the family were so poor that they were on what you would call the poor houses, or the workhouses in England. But there was a process by which all of these people who were very indigenous could apply, sort of not voluntarily apply, but were applied and offered a position in Australia. So they were basically turned into criminals and shipped to Australia, and they got there in Australia. But in order to get there, they had to be baptized in the Church of England. And so the entire family was christened on the same day. So guessing at when the years and when those children were born is, you can only use a rule of thumb like every 2 years or something like that, which is something you commonly see also. So now let's go back to the Research Wiki. You'll see that the United States specific birth, marriage, and death records are relatively recent. And this is an example from Utah. Utah's vital records. Of course, Utah hasn't been around as long as some states, but birth records, the earliest birth records you're going to find consistently in Utah are about 1890. Statewide registration, meaning they said it's time everybody recorded their birth record dates, began about 1905. But it wasn't until 1922 that there was a mechanism where the hospitals and the doctors and everyone filled out the birth certificates, and the midwives and everyone else, that everyone sort of became required to have a birth record. What happened subsequently to that, of course, is that the governments began, and even companies began, implementing processes that required someone to produce a birth record for something. And the one mechanism that created that with the most universality were the public school systems. When the public schools said, we can't enroll your child unless they have a birth certificate, because we'd have to know how old they are. And you can't tell us how old this child is, because we won't believe you that you know when this child was born. So that was when things became more specific and more available. So it took that period of time. And so when you're looking back for a birth record in Utah, and you say, I'd like to know when my great-grandmother or great-great-grandmother was born, and she was born in Salt Lake City, Utah in 1867. And your answer back is, unless the church recorded that, then no one else did. And so where we have now, and I've just mentioned the secondary source. We definitely, when there's no more vital records from the governments, we go to the churches. And another example down here in Burke County, Georgia, birth records began only in 1927. And this is not a Western country. This is over on the Eastern Seaboard. Georgia didn't record births, and statewide began in 1919, but general compliance didn't happen until for births by 1928 and deaths by 1922. But that still meant that even if you use up the term, and you look at that term of general compliance, that means it was generally complied. That doesn't mean every baby that was born was recorded. And we get death dates. Death is the same date. Court dates go back quite a ways. Land records go back a ways. Probate records go back a ways, and census records go back a ways. So does this give you sort of an insight into the fact that if we're worried about whether or not someone was born and who they are and how we're trying to determine who they are, we may wish to move from a focus on birth and death records to court, land, probate, and census records as additional categories for a start. So there's ways, in other words, ways to move backward in time. And I would also kind of indicate that it's not really healthy to get so fixated on establishing a birth date or a death date as it might seem to be. So what's the current status of records, of those kinds of records, of BMD, birth records, what we call vital records? The answer is that in order to even begin to do the research, like here in the National Archives for certain types of things, is we need to know when and where they first became available. So in any type of record, that means we need to know that that kind of record is available. Now, when we're talking about birth, marriage, and death records, we need to also refer to the issue of birth certificates, marriage certificates or licenses, and death certificates or licenses. Now, marriage records fall into a different category. Birth and death records are very personal, and the fact that a person is born is evident. If they're alive and if they're interacting with society, then we know they're born. If they're dead, we know the other side of it. If they're not here, they're not interacting in society, then they're probably dead. But marriage is a different thing. Marriage is a legal state between individuals. It's created by law and by religious tradition. But the marriage itself is more important because when in our most universally in almost all societies, a marriage affects property ownership. And so the way that property is owned, or who owns property, and whether a person can or cannot own property is generally determined by whether or not they're married. If they're married, then they have these certain property conditions and obligations and rules. And if they're not married, then they don't have those same obligations, rules, and conditions. So marriage records are usually well kept, and they're usually kept because people needed to know when and where someone was married, because what if they claimed to be married and they weren't, or what if they were claimed not to be married and they were, and that would create some very difficult legal consequences in almost uniformly throughout all of the cultures of the world. So these things needed to be done. And so what you find is marriage records will go back, and the evidence of a marriage will go back very, very far back into the time. And so what does that mean? That means that if you're a careful researcher and you're wishing to make your work as accurate as possible, you would focus on marriage records, preferably over birth and death records. If you have a marriage record, then you know that the person, the husband and the wife, and whoever were joined together in matrimony were alive at the time. So we've already established birth. We've already established a lack of death, which is important. And we've also established a time frame. And if you're doing your records properly, you know a location of where that marriage took place. And so we have a lot of information that we can go there, you build on. Whereas if we have a birth record, that doesn't tell us much. It never tells us if they ever got married. It doesn't tell us where or when or they lived after they got older than the date of their birth. And it actually doesn't tell you where they lived, depending on where the mother happened to be when the baby was born. So this is, that's kind of the issue. Now, as far as what's happening today, and here's a rather long citation to a document which I'm not saying you need to go and look at. I'm just saying there are documents out there that state that even though there are jurisdictions that exist in the United States, all of the ones, all these different jurisdictions, including the territories and other common other things that are associated with the United States. All of these different organizations, the states and territories organizations, and there is sort of a uniform and consistent requirement for recording birth, marriage, and death records. It doesn't happen, that they're just simply not conforming to this today. So there's still a certain what you might call margin of error, lack of records that are going to happen every year. And there are a lot of discussion about this and how we could overcome this and get more records and information about the people. What instigates that? Taxes, military enrollment, schools, population numbers for electing officials in the United States, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a lot of reason. So full compliance by all the states in the United States is yet to happen. So even if you're thinking about someone who was born in the last 25 years or 30 or 50 years, you're still a very significant chance that there's no record made, that they managed to be there, get born or married or died without ever having a record. So let's start again. Let's go back to the Research Wiki and talk about the civil records. Now, when we talk about civil records, what we mean is, and the term we use constantly is called civil registration records. And that's the ones that I mentioned just a while ago were instigated initially by Napoleon on a national basis that created a copy of that national civil registration. So what you end up with is civil registration in South America, civil registration throughout Europe, civil registration in many parts of Africa, civil registration in the Far East, and in many other big countries, even though they were never conquered by or implied used any part of the Napoleon's civil registration requirements. So basically, you always look for civil registration records, and they are equally important because they have birth, marriage, and death records, and they do record that. And for example, if you're doing research in Scandinavia, you'll find civil registration records go back quite a long time back into the past, and they are very accurate and very useful. So there are some things beyond just the pure birth, marriage, and death. The secondary source would be civil registration, and which I must remind after a moments of what I mentioned just a moments ago, is the United States doesn't have any comparable civil registration requirement. And no one ever has to get, when they immediately get born, has to go to the government and get an ID card and become part of the civil registration system. You might say, well, there's analogies between having birth certificates and civil registration, except that's not the way that works. There's no national birth record requirement. And so even then, most records, most states, most organizations out there, in the civil records do not have full compliance well into the 1900s. So how far back can we go? What can we rely on? Well, you can start looking for birth and death information and marriages in Massachusetts back in 1639. But those records are in the town records for each community. That means they're written out in longhand and handwriting in the course of keeping all the town records. And there are very few of these that are indexed. They may very well get indexed more quickly and more completely once artificial intelligence and handwriting recognition get rolling past some of the records that they're doing presently. And at some point in time, you may be able to search an entire town record online by the name of the person and come up with all the instances. But presently, you have to read through the records. But that's where their records are kept. And if you want to go further back than when they began birth certificates in Massachusetts, you need to go through the town records for the place where the people, or the places where the people lived, page by page. You may be able to estimate or guesstimate when the person was born, which may limit your, you may only have to read a few hundred pages to see whether or not you can find the record. But you might be interested to know that sometimes in a town record, the town clerk would summarize at a later date. So there may be a marriage or a birth in a family, and they went, oh, wait a minute, the rest of the children were born at this time. So you can never be sure unless you read through an entire town record that you haven't missed some of the information concerning your particular families. So there are some places like Rhode Island and Massachusetts and other places, there are extracted compilations of the early birth and vital records, records that were generated by various individuals. And one of the largest collections, especially for Rhode Island, is by a man by the name of James Arnold, the Arnold records. And those are subject to transcription errors, but they are reliable and they are useful, and they do not give you enough information to be absolutely sure you have the right person, because it may just say baby George born to Mary and George Smith on such and such a date. And it doesn't really give you enough to know if you have the right Smith family. So what happens if they're not available? So where are we if birth, marriage, and death records simply do not exist in the time frame of the place that we're looking to find them? And I mentioned this a couple of times now, that some researchers just continue to look without success because it's on the form and it's required, and we need to know the birth record. And the answer to that is not. This actually is the second rule of genealogy. And the second rule of genealogy said is absence of an obituary or death record does not mean the person is still alive. And you can rephrase that as you wish. Absence of a birth record does not mean the person was not born, and absence of a married record does not mean the person was not married. And yet there are people who come to me and ask, I've never been able to find a marriage record for this couple, but so what can I do? I don't know if they're married. And the answer is, did they live together? Well, yeah, they're on the census. Did they have children? Well, yeah, they show census children. Well, then as far as genealogy is concerned, they were married. We're not worried about a certificate or a date or whatever. All we know is that there was some kind of relationship, and from the historical record we have a presumption that this person was married because they lived together and had children. So those two categories create, as far as historically is concerned, create the concept of a marriage. So I think it's really time to move on down the road and make some new discoveries out there and get out into some other areas where you're not confined by thinking that you have to find this birth record. And that's particularly frustrating once you pass that line in whichever country you're working in. Here in the United States, depending on the state, you can see those lines are fairly recent. Some of the countries, you have a hope of finding christening records back into the 1600s, possibly. And in some occasions, less frequently, you can find good christening records back into the 1500s. But by the time you get to the mid 1500s, being able to find any kind of concrete birth or death records are pretty much limited throughout Europe. And there may be some, and other countries do have more records that go back further. But in the case of the vast number of people from Western Europe and from significantly from many, many other countries, there is always a date somewhere in the 1500s that you are no longer able to adequately find these records. So if you're worried about it, then you have things that are out there that are helps. And I'm going back to the Research Wiki with the United States Record Finder. And what that says, if you're searching for a birth date and place, here's the best places to search: vital records, church records, census records, and town records. If you can't find it in any of those records, then you go to cemeteries, obituaries, newspapers, and Bible records. Now, that doesn't complete the list of places you can go, because there are also school records, and there are also business records and military records, and it goes on and on. But here's kind of a way of indicating that there are places where you can go to get additional information once you run out of finding birth, marriage, and death records any directly. And marriage, place, and date, vital records, church records, census records. Do they sound like some of the same records? Yes, they do. Newspapers, town records, Bible records, cemeteries, military, probate, naturalization and citizenship, and land and property, and essentially all of the record types that are listed on the right-hand side of this particular page from the Research Wiki. Because there's possibility that a record would reflect the age or date of birth of a person, and you would be able to find out to more specifically when they were born. And it goes on. This is not the end of these record finders, but there are record finders like this available on the Research Wiki and in other places that help you understand when and how these records should be used. Okay, so this is, they have, the Research Wiki has one of these pages for each state and more general such pages for other locations. So there's usually some way telling you that if you can't find it here, you need to go here. And if you can't find it here, you need to go here. Now, what would be the evidence that somebody had actually done this? Well, in the case of the Family Search Family Tree, it would be sources listed that fell outside of the standard birth, marriage, death records, and you saw references to a cemetery or to an obituary or to a newspaper article or a Bible record or a town record or whatever. And that would give you two things. That would tell you that the person who added those sources went way beyond birth, marriage, and death. And you would also realize that the person that had those additional records was probably getting to be about as well established and well known as it may be possible in some cases. So this is the Research Wiki. This is what we've been talking about. But one of the things that you need to look at from the standpoint of beginning this process is that you've got instructions on how to proceed and what records you may want to look at. So you can go to guided research in many countries that are now available on the wiki, and more will probably be added as time goes on. But these take you step by step and ask you questions. And there's a list on the Research Wiki of the countries that are available presently. So if you're doing research in any of these countries, you will find a specific page which gives you a link that gives you guided research. And here's a longer view of the list. So these are, as you can see here, many of the Western European countries and a few other places that have been developed so far. So let's look at England, for example. This is guided research, England guided research from the Research Wiki. And they're asking two questions. I know the county. I do not know the county. Okay, so they're starting where you really should start as far as research is concerned, and determining whether or not you know an exact place where a event in your ancestors' lives occurred. And so this is starting you at the county level because that's where the records are primarily from in England, back in 1851. So do you know the county where your ancestors lived? So if you know it, then you click on the no. If you don't, you'd click on the other. And then if you know, here's a list of the counties, and you can click here and go through and see additional records for each of these counties. So here's an example. Here's Yorkshire. So the question is asking if you want birth, marriage, or death records. And if you click on that, birth, for example, it'll give you a link to the records, but not on Family Search, on Find My Past. And it will also give you other collections that may be on Family Search. And then they have your list of things that you can click on, like substitute records or how to improve your searching, finding the town of origin, all of the things that may help you to move beyond just the major, systematic searching for birth, marriage, and death. And remember now, as I mentioned before, the distinction between births and baptisms. So when you fill in a record, don't assume that the baptism is directly or even indirectly related to the birth, other than the fact that the baptism is an evidence that the person actually lived, and it gives you a specific fixed date that you can work around. So here, for example, is if you're following the Yorkshire births and click on what else can I find or try, there are lists and lists of records to look in. So you just got to keep clicking. You've got to working your way through this process and this procedure. So here's one of the processes that we go through as we improve our research and genealogical research skills. And that is we need to learn about where the records have been kept and how they're available and what we need to do to gain access to those records. So sometimes that involves a significant effort. When I went to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., I went through their process of qualifying for a reader's card. And then I found out that the process of finding the records or acquiring the records would involve far more time than I had available to do the research. It wasn't that I was disappointed because I didn't have in any kind of particular research goal at the time. I was just seeing what the process took. And it turned out to be fairly involved. And the same way with the Library of Congress and other types of archives and things around the world. As you learn about them and you learn how to access the records and where to access the records, you very well may take time, as I have in other locations, such as the National Archives in Philadelphia, the National Archives in Denver, the National Archives in other locations, to research records directly from those locations. So when all else fails, when you get to the point where you'd say, well, I don't really know what to do next. I just never can find this person. It just never seems a very elusive person, never seems to be able to find the person. Then you should take this kind of rule of thumb. The rule of thumb is a broadly accurate guide or principle based on experience or practice rather than theory. So when we resort to a rule of thumb, it presupposes that we have already got the experience and practice that we need to find the record, and we're just using this because our efforts have been unavailable. Basically, it can also be used to, in a sense, prime the pump. In other words, if you can't find an individual because you don't know have a birth entry in an online website, you may estimate one, and if you estimate one, you may very well end up finding a record, because it will narrow down the numbers of people with the same name that you want that you're looking at. So we've developed estimates or rules of thumb to have a birth, marriage, or death date for research purposes. So that's kind of the way. And now, if you're thinking about it, these are the most common ones. There may be may differ. Your experience with these may differ, but the genealogical rules are: a birth is approximately 20 years before the birth of the first child, or marriage, whichever is earliest. Now, immediately you're going to look at that and say it's not accurate, because person could get married at 14, or they might not have ever gotten married until they were 26 or 30, and they didn't have any children until they were after 20 years or whatever. No. Okay, so the marriage birth from the marriage is the rule of thumb is 20 years. And then from the marriage, to estimate the marriage, you go to the birth of the first child. And so approximately a year before the birth of the first child, you can assume there was some kind of a marriage record. Now, these are not kinds of things that we rely on by saying, yes, that is now when he was born. No, these are things that give us a range of dates where we can start and begin to look for further research and information about these people. But there's no way to estimate a death. But sometimes you have to approximate when they disappear from the records. You have to say he was born before a certain date because it just became ridiculously long, or he was born after a certain date because that's the last record you have that shows that the person was alive. But when you estimate a death date, that really doesn't help, because then you can estimate it, and if you're accurately in your estimate, then you have a chance of finding the record using that as the time period. So be as specific as possible to avoid creating a more duplicate records. Most of the time when you find duplicates on any of the family trees, you find them because the information on one or both of the records are so vague as not to give an accurate picture of who the person was. So here's the rule 4 of the rules of genealogy is important, that there are always more records. And people come to me and they say, I have looked everywhere. And I just say, you haven't lived long enough to have looked everywhere. And so if we sit down and we talk and we develop what we've done, we'll probably find many, many more places to look, and much more, and many more records than we could possibly have imagined existed. And that happens to me every day, by the way, regularly, I won't say every day, but regularly I am made aware of huge collections of records that I never knew existed. And it's inevitable. Okay, well, that kind of concludes it for today. Do we have any questions out there?
Looks like we have one question from Sarah in the chat. She says, I could never find birth records for mother and sister born in Arkansas, Louisiana. Birthdays 1931 for aunt and 1934 for mom. Any suggestions to where to research next?
Okay, well, the excuse me. The answer to that is the record selection chart that I showed you in the research wiki. Is go to different kinds of records that may show something more about their lives. If you already know they exist, or you have them in a marriage record or something else, then I would not focus on that. I would not become overly obsessive with finding a birth record, particularly in Arkansas or Louisiana. I'm sorry, but the South were some of the latest states to implement even consistent birth, marriage, and death records. So the fact that somebody doesn't have a birth record is not surprising. And if this is what they want to know, who wants to know? The question is, why is that essential? What is it that's about the birth record that is so important? They want to know for their own. Okay, well, let me mention a whole process that exists. It's called an alternative birth or death record or whatever. If you go to a country, if you go to some of the states, and particularly the states in the South, you can do this, is you go to the state and you say, I would like to apply for a substitute birth record. And so there's a process where you go there and you tell them you believe you were born in this year and whatever, and they will actually create a birth record for you. That's this alternative birth record or alternative death record if you need one for some other reason. So if you want to do that, then that's the answer. You just go there, and there's legal procedures that you go through, and they require a certain amount of information, and then they hand you a birth certificate showing when you were born. And we do find those, and we encounter those occasionally. I'm sorry I didn't mention them earlier, but thanks for the question.
We have a question in the Q&A. Says, how accurate are family Bible records?
They are records which were created at or near the time of an event by someone who either witnessed the event or felt they had a responsibility or was required by law or whatever to record the event. So the answer is they're some of the most accurate records we can find, because generally speaking, what they wrote down was what they celebrated as their birthday throughout their life. Now, if they were wrong, I don't think we usually have a way of finding out that was not correct. So I think I have had Bible records be the absolute, opening to the whole line of some people that helps me. So I very frequently get to the point where I'm looking for a Bible record. Okay. Anything else out there? They want the notes. I'll send over the slides, and we'll put those into our archive. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you so much.
Perfect. We'll go ahead and close. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which is on February 9th with Catherine Grant. She will be giving a presentation entitled Best Practices for Entering Information in Family Search Family Tree, Part 2, Specific Guidance. A recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fhl_webinars@byu.edu or follow Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.